The man's knuckles were white where he gripped her arm. His name was Garrett Vance, and the only thing more rigid than his piety was the hatred in his eyes. He was dragging Abigail Hale through the center of Providence, and the whole town had come out to watch. The dust kicked up by her bare feet coated her ankles, a gritty second skin. It was 1881, and justice here was a public spectacle, sharp and brutal as a shard of glass. Her aunt followed a few paces behind, her face a stone mask of shame. Her uncle wasn't there. He couldn't bear to see the disgrace brought upon his house. Abigail's disgrace, her sin. They were all there, the faces she saw every day across the counter of the general store. Mistress Donovan, who'd cried on her shoulder last Tuesday about the price of flour, now stared with a cold, hungry curiosity. The McBride boys, who she'd chased out of the apple barrel a dozen times, were now chanting a word she didn't understand, but she felt its filth in her bones. Jezebel. Garrett shoved her, and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell. His breath was hot and sour against her ear. The whole town's waiting, sinner. She didn't know what was worse, the grip on her arm or the low, satisfied rumble in his voice. This wasn't just about God's law for him. This was personal. This was a victory. They reached the town square. In the center, there was a crude wooden platform, hastily built, and on the platform, a single, lonely stool. It looked like a throne for the damned. At the base of the platform stood Reverend Blackwood. His black coat hung on his scarecrow frame, and his eyes burned with a fire that promised hell, not heaven. He was the one who had condemned her. No trial, no questions, just a verdict thundered from his porch the moment Garrett Vance had come running, breathless and gleeful, with his story. An abomination, the Reverend had roared, for the whole town to hear. She has lain with the savage, polluted herself, and brought the stain of her sin upon this God-fearing community. Garrett had seen her by the river. That was true. But he'd seen more than that. He'd seen her hand in his. He'd seen her smile in a way she never smiled in Providence. He had seen her with Chayton, not just any Lakota warrior, the chief's son. And for that, she was being led to the center of this circle of hate, to be unmade. Reverend Blackwood climbed the 2 steps onto the platform, his movements stiff and self-important. He held his Bible aloft, not like a book of comfort, but like a club. His voice boomed across the silent square, a sound as dry and unforgiving as the Dakota wind. "Let this day be a lesson," he began, his voice cracking with righteous fury. "Let the fate of this woman be a stark reminder of the wages of sin." Abigail kept her head high. She wouldn't give them her tears. Her fear was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but her defiance was a shield, and that shield was forged in the memory of a riverbank, of a low, gentle voice, of eyes that held no judgment. The Reverend's voice droned on, a litany of damnation. She turned her back on her own kind, on decency, on God himself. She opened the door to darkness, and we must now purify this house. Purify. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. She knew what it meant. She'd seen it done once before, to a man accused of stealing horses. It was a cleansing of the soul through the humiliation of the flesh. Garrett Vance shoved her from behind, forcing her toward the stool. "Time for your sermon, little lamb," he sneered. His glee was a sickness. She'd seen it before. He was a man who found God in the suffering of others. As she sat on the hard wood, she finally met his gaze, and in the glint of his eyes, she saw the truth. He hadn't just stumbled upon her and Chayton. He had been looking. He had been watching her for weeks, his shadow lingering by the cottonwoods, a silent, jealous predator. He'd wanted her, and when he couldn't have her, he decided to destroy her. "Hold still," he grunted, his face far too close to hers, and then he produced them. A pair of heavy sheep shears, dull and rusted at the joint. The metal glinted in the harsh sun. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a sound of both horror and morbid excitement. They were going to get their show. The cold, unforgiving metal touched the back of her neck. A sob she could no longer contain tore from her throat. Her hair. It was her one vanity, her only piece of beauty in a life of drab duty. A thick, honey-brown cascade that fell to her waist. Chayton had once run his fingers through it, his touch reverent. He'd called it a river of sunlight. Now, that river was about to be desecrated. She closed her eyes, trying to flee, trying to run back to the memory of his touch. But there was no escape. There was only the sound of rusted metal hinges groaning open, and then the first brutal, tearing cut. The shears weren't sharp. They were made for coarse wool, not hair. They snagged and pulled, a violent, ripping sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence of the square. The first thick lock of her hair fell into the dust at her feet. It lay there like a dead thing. Then another, and another. Garrett worked with a grim, focused energy, his knuckles brushing her scalp with each pass. Each cut was a violation, a stripping away of her identity, a shearing of the woman Chayton had known. She was being unmade, lock by painful lock. She didn't cry out again. A strange, cold calm settled over her, the kind of peace that comes when the worst thing you can imagine is finally happening. The pain became distant, a dull ache somewhere far away. Her body was on this stool, in this square, surrounded by hate, but her spirit was elsewhere. Her spirit was by the river. It was there she had first felt truly alive. For 5 years since her parents' passing, she had been a ghost in her aunt and uncle's house, her existence measured in chores and prayers, a duty, a burden. The town saw her silence as meekness, her sorrow as a weakness. They never saw the fire inside her, the desperate yearning for something more than gray days and hollow sermons. The river was her only escape. And it was there she met him. He'd found her with her ankle twisted in a mess of roots, her basket of berries spilled across the damp earth. Her first thought was fear. A lifetime of Reverend Blackwood's warnings flooded her mind. Brutal heathens, savages who prowled the edges of their civilized world. But the man who knelt before her didn't look like a monster. His eyes, dark and steady, held only a quiet concern. His movements were fluid, unhurried, as he worked her foot free with hands that were surprisingly gentle. He spoke in careful, measured English, his voice softer than she'd expected. "You are hurt?" "No," she had whispered, her skin tingling where he had touched it. "Thank you." He helped her gather her berries, his silence more comfortable than any conversation she'd ever had in her uncle's stuffy parlor. He told her his name was Chayton. It was only later she learned he was the son of Tashunka, the great Lakota chief, a name spoken in Providence with both fear and grudging respect. It should have terrified her. It didn't. Their meetings became her secret sacrament. She would tell her aunt she was seeking wildflowers. He would tell his people he was observing the patterns of the river. They would talk for hours on that neutral shore, their two worlds bleeding into one another. He taught her the Lakota names for the stars, weaving stories of ancient spirits into the night sky until it was no longer an empty void, but a living tapestry. He taught her to read the land, to see the story of a broken twig, to smell the coming rain on the wind. The world, which had always felt like a hostile place, began to feel like a home. In return, she shared the only world she had, the one in her books. She told him of kings and oceans, of cities with buildings that scraped the clouds. She told him about her parents, about the profound, hollowing loneliness that had followed their death. "Your people live close," he had observed one evening, watching the distant lights of Providence flicker. "But you are alone." "Sometimes being surrounded by people is the loneliest thing of all," she had replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. He had understood. He spoke of his own burdens, the weight of being his father's son, the expectations of his people. In those moments, he wasn't the savage from the sermons, and she wasn't the pale, fragile settler. They were just two people, finding in each other a reflection of their own hidden landscapes. He had held her hands one evening, the setting sun painting the river in shades of orange and red. His gaze was earnest, intense. "I will not leave you in this place," he had promised. "My path is your path now. A promise." The word was a bitter mockery now. The shearing continued, a methodical destruction. With every lock of hair that fell, she felt lighter, not with relief, but with a terrifying emptiness. The sun beat down on her newly exposed scalp, hot and shaming. He wasn't here. Of course he wasn't here. If he came now, they would kill him without a second thought. The knowledge was both a comfort and an agony. When Garrett was finally finished, he stepped back, breathing heavily, to admire his work. Her head was a ruin of ragged, uneven tufts. Her scalp showed through, pale and vulnerable. A few women in the crowd tittered nervously. Others finally looked away, a flicker of pity breaking through their righteous facade too late. Reverend Blackwood raised his hands again, his voice triumphant. "Behold, the mark of shame," he declared. "Let her be an outcast among us. Let no one offer her comfort or aid. Let her live with her sin, exposed for all to see, until she repents in the dust." They released their grip on her. She didn't move. She couldn't summon the strength to stand. Her shorn hair lay around her feet like a funeral wreath. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, in the center of a circle of hate. She was 1,000 miles from the river and 1,000,000 miles from Chayton. The fragile hope she had nurtured in secret had been trampled into the dust, and she was left with nothing but the shame they had branded upon her skin. The days that followed were a blur of hollow survival. The town obeyed the Reverend's command as if it had come from God himself. Her aunt and uncle met her at the door, not with comfort, but with a small bundle. Inside was a single loaf of stale bread, a skin of water, and a threadbare blanket. Then they barred the door. She was no longer their family. She was no longer their problem. The storekeeper, a man she'd worked for since she was a child, refused to sell her provisions. "We don't serve your kind here," he'd said, not even meeting her eye. Children, who just weeks ago would have shyly offered her a wildflower, now followed her, throwing stones that stung her back and legs. When she tried to draw water from the public well, they drove her away. She found refuge in an abandoned line shack at the very edge of town, barely more than a pile of crumbling sod and splintered wood. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, a constant grieving moan. It was a place for things that were broken and forgotten. It was a place for her. Her shorn head was a brand. She found a thin, stained scarf and wrapped it around her head, but it did little to hide the shame. She could still feel the phantom weight of what was lost. It wasn't just the hair. It was the severing of her connection to him. Her hair had been part of their story, a tangible piece of the love they shared. Now it was gone, and she felt like a ghost, haunting the fringes of a life that was no longer hers. Grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath an effort. She spent her hours staring east, across the shallow river, toward the lands where he lived. She wondered if word of her punishment had reached his people. Part of her prayed it had not. The thought of his pain, of the anger and helplessness he would feel, was somehow worse than her own. 1 week after the shearing, the sun was bleeding its last crimson light across the horizon, staining the clouds a bruised purple. And that's when she saw it. A plume of dust in the distance, rising from the east. At first, she dismissed it. A dust devil, a common trick of the eye on the vast, empty plains. But it didn't dissipate. It grew larger, thicker, resolving itself into a long, dark line against the dying light. It was a line of riders, many riders. Her heart seized in her chest, a fist of pure ice. Her first sickening thought was not of rescue, but of revenge. It was a war party. The Reverend's greatest fear, The nightmare he used to keep his flock in line was now galloping toward Providence. And it was her fault. Her sin, as the Reverend called it, had brought this upon them. Men would die, women and children would suffer, the blood would be on her hands. She scrambled to her feet, a primal instinct screaming at her to run, to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The land was flat and open, offering no sanctuary. She could only stand beside her pathetic, crumbling shack and watch them approach, a lone, desolate figure awaiting the apocalypse she had wrought. The town had seen them too. A bell began to clang frantically from the church steeple. Not the steady, rhythmic call to Sunday prayer, but a wild, panicked alarm. Doors slammed shut all across Providence. Men with rifles appeared on rooftops, their silhouettes stark and grim against the twilight sky. The air, which moments before had been still and peaceful, grew thick with a terrible, silent tension. The very land itself seemed to hold its breath. The riders were closer now, close enough for her to make out details, and as she did, a deep confusion began to cut through her terror. Something was wrong. They weren't riding hard, not with the furious speed of an attack. They moved with a slow, deliberate solemnity. It looked less like a charge and more like a procession. They carried lances, but the lances were decorated with feathers and sacred bundles, not brandished for war. They were riding with a purpose, but that purpose wasn't bloodshed. At the head of the procession rode two figures. One was a man whose presence was so powerful it seemed to command the very landscape. His magnificent war bonnet, a cascade of eagle feathers, bespoke his great authority. It was Chief Tashunka. And beside him, riding tall and straight, his face set like carved stone, was Chaitin. His eyes found her instantly across the 100 yards of open ground that separated them. He didn't look at the armed men on the rooftops. He didn't look at the shuttered windows of the town. He looked only at her. His face was a mask of unreadable emotion, but deep in his eyes she saw a fire burning, a fire that seared away her fear and replaced it with a wild, incredulous hope that was almost as painful. The procession didn't ride toward the center of town. They flowed around it, a silent, powerful river of men and horses coming to a halt directly in front of her dilapidated shack. They formed a wide, silent crescent, hemming her in. But it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a shield. The armed men of Providence watched from their perches, confused and unnerved. This wasn't the battle they had prepared for. This was something else entirely, something they didn't understand. Chief Tashunka remained on his horse, his gaze sweeping over the town with a look of profound, weary disdain. But Chaitin dismounted. He handed the reins of his horse to another warrior and began to walk toward her. He moved with the same fluid grace she remembered from the riverbank, his moccasins making no sound on the dry, cracked earth. He carried no weapon. In his hands he held something wrapped in soft buckskin, holding it with the reverence one would afford a sacred object. Abigail stood frozen, her heart a wild drum in her chest. The thin scarf on her head suddenly felt like a coward's banner, a sign of her shame. With a trembling hand, she reached up and pulled it off, letting it fall to the dust. She would meet him without hiding. She would let him see the ragged ruin of her hair. She would let him see what they had done. If he turned from her now, in disgust or pity, she would understand. It was better to face the truth of it, whatever it might be. He stopped a few feet from her. His eyes took in her shorn head, and a flicker of immense pain crossed his features, so deep it was as if he himself had been struck. But it was followed instantly by a look of such fierce, unwavering tenderness that it made her knees weak. He saw the wound, but he saw her beyond the wound. Just then, a figure emerged from the town, striding out from between the buildings with an air of self-important fury. It was Reverend Blackwood, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. Garrett Vance and a few other men trailed behind him, emboldened by his presence. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" the Reverend demanded, his voice straining to maintain its authority in the face of this silent, intimidating force. "You are not welcome here, savage! Leave this place at once!" Chaitin did not even glance at him. His focus was entirely, completely on Abigail. He took another step closer, his voice low and clear, meant only for her but carrying on the still evening air for all to hear. "They took your hair," he said. His voice was thick with a sorrow that mirrored her own. Then he paused, and his next words landed like stones. "In my grandfather's time, this was done to a woman who was unfaithful to her husband." Abigail flinched. The hope that had flared in her chest guttered and died. A mark of shame. That's what he saw. He had come all this way only to confirm her disgrace in the language of his own people. The humiliation was so profound, so complete, that she wished the earth would open and swallow her whole. But he wasn't finished. He looked up from her, his gaze finally sweeping over Reverend Blackwood and the men of Providence. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, hard and ancient and unforgiving. "But," he continued, and his voice rose, imbued with a strength that pushed back against the encroaching twilight, a strength that made the armed men on the rooftops seem small and foolish. "To take it from a woman who has given her heart truly, who has shown courage in the face of hatred, that is not shame." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent, watching town. "That is a sacrilege." He turned his full attention back to Abigail, and the hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by the profound love she had thought was lost to her forever. He began to unwrap the buckskin bundle he was holding. "You do not know what honor is," he said, his voice now a quiet condemnation aimed at the Reverend. "You mistake cruelty for justice and noise for strength. You tried to mark this woman with your shame." He looked directly at Blackwood, a flicker of something that looked like pity in his eyes. "You have failed." He raised the object he had been holding. It was a headdress. Not a warrior's bonnet like his father's, but something smaller, more delicate. It was crafted from the finest, softest white buckskin, intricately beaded with symbols she didn't understand, but whose beauty she felt in her soul. And at the back, a single, perfect golden eagle feather stood straight and proud. More feathers, from the hawk and the falcon, cascaded down the sides, framing the space where her own hair should have been. It was a thing of breathtaking beauty and immense significance. "The eagle feather is our highest honor," Chaitin explained softly, his eyes locked on hers. "It is not taken. It is earned. It is given for a great act of courage. It tells our people that the one who wears it has a spirit that cannot be broken. It tells them that they are cherished, that they belong to us." Reverend Blackwood sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is blasphemy, covering one sin with another." Chaitin ignored him as if he were a buzzing fly. He took the final step, closing the space between them. With an infinite, impossible gentleness, he reached out and placed the headdress on her head. The soft buckskin settled over her scalp, a soothing balm on her raw, shamed skin. The feathers fell around her face and down her back, covering the pathetic, hacked remnants of her hair. It was not a covering of shame. It was a coronation. He wasn't hiding what they had done, he was transforming it. He was taking the symbol of her lowest moment and crowning it with the symbol of his people's highest honor. Tears she had refused to shed in the square, tears she had choked back in her lonely shack, now welled in her eyes and streamed down her cheeks. They were not tears of pain or humiliation, but of a gratitude so immense it felt like it could split her heart open. He had not come with fire and vengeance. He had come with dignity. He had come with a love so powerful it answered all their ugliness, with a beauty so profound it silenced them all. He did not kiss her. He did not embrace her. The moment was too sacred. He simply rested his hand on the side of her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. In that one touch, she felt everything. His grief for her suffering, his fury at her tormentors, and his absolute, unshakable commitment. He stepped back and finally turned to face the stunned people of Providence. His voice was no longer soft. It was a clear, ringing proclamation for his own warriors and for the terrified settlers hiding behind their rifles. "Her name is Abigail Hale," he declared. "She is not your outcast. She is my chosen wife. Her honor is my honor. Her people are my people. From this day forward, she walks my path." Silence. A deep, profound silence fell over the square, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the feathers of her new crown. Then, from his place on horseback, Chief Tushunka gave a single, sharp nod. It was a silent, powerful affirmation of his son's words. The crescent of warriors shifted, their horses moving as one, opening a path. Chaitin turned and walked back to his horse with that same unhurried grace. He mounted in a single, fluid motion. Then he looked at Abigail, still standing before her broken-down shack, and held out his hand to her. It was a choice. Stay here, in the ruins of her old life, forever branded by their hate but now strangely, powerfully defended. Or take his hand and step into a future she could not possibly imagine. It was no choice at all. She walked toward him, her back straight, the feathers of her headdress swaying with each step. She felt the eyes of the entire town on her, but for the first time, their judgment had no power. It could not touch her. She was shielded by an honor far older and stronger than their petty fears. She placed her hand in Chaitin's, and his grip was strong and warm. He pulled her up to sit in front of him on his horse, settling her against his chest. It felt like coming home. As the Lakota procession began to turn, a single, powerful unit preparing to depart, Abigail looked back one last time at the town of Providence. She saw Reverend Blackwood standing impotent in the dust, his Bible hanging uselessly at his side, his face a mask of disbelief. She saw Garrett Vance staring, his mouth agape, his great act of cruel dominance rendered utterly meaningless. She saw the faces in the windows, pale with shock and a dawning, terrible understanding that their world was smaller and weaker than they had ever believed. They had tried to shave her down to nothing, they had tried to erase her, but they had failed. He hadn't just saved her, he had redefined her. He had taken their mark of shame and made it a crown of glory. As they rode toward the river, toward the open lands of his people, she leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest. The wind that had once felt so cruel now felt like a promise, carrying the scent of sage and freedom. It lifted the eagle feather in her headdress, a banner of her unbroken spirit. For the first time in her life, Abigail Hale felt like she was truly going home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of the unexpected.